One of the hardest things to decide for new players and veterans alike is how many lands to play in your deck. Now, there's a ton of articles out there, specifically a few from Frank Karsten, who's kind of like the math genius of Magic the Gathering, that really breaks down all of the math that goes involved in deciding how many lands are in your deck. But for normal people like you or I, a lot of the stuff doesn't really make sense. Instead, what I wanted to do in this video is sort of break down Frank Karsten's data. And by the way, we are using Frank Karsten's math and using some of his charts, so I totally want to attribute that to him, to help me and you decide how many lands we should be playing in our deck. So this first chart we're going to look at is a chart that Frank Karsten made that kind of divides everything up so that for each number of lands in a 60-card deck, from 17 to 28 lands in a 60-card deck, which is kind of the reasonable variables, the chances of you hitting land drops on each one of the turns. Now, the first column is obviously lands in deck. The second column is the probability of you having your second land on turn 2. The third column is your probability of having third land on turn 3, et cetera, et cetera. The last two columns are a little interesting. The second to last column is your expected opening hand. So how much you'll have to mulligan, how many cards you should expect to have in your opener in any given hand, and if you need to mulligan into a hand, with a reasonable amount of lands. And the last column is the percentage that you can flood. The chance of you mana flooding, drawing too many lands. Also, you'll notice there are two percentages in each column. The first percentage is your chance on the draw. The second percentage is your chance on the play. Now, you don't need to memorize this data, but it's really interesting to look at the actual numbers behind all of this. And just looking at this, it's reasonably easy to sort of decide how many lands you should be having in your deck. For example, if you need to be playing a 4-mana spell on turn 4 and you want to do that reliably, 17 lands is probably a bad deal because there's only 41% chance you'll be able to do that on the play. You probably want to be closer to 22, 23, maybe even 24 lands so that you can get 63, 67, 71% chance to do that on the play. However, if you don't really care about, hitting your lands on turn 4 or turn 3 or whatever, and you're okay functioning on 1, 2, maybe 3 lands, or, what this doesn't function for is you have a lot of cantrips and you can filter through your deck. Maybe you want to lean towards that 17, 18, 19 lands so that you don't get flooded, right? You look at this last column and you keep the flood chance under 3%. That would make sense as well. Now, so that's for a 60-card deck. So what about limited? In limited, here's another graph by Frank Karsten. The reasonable amount of lands, 12 I think is a little unreasonable. But 12 to 20 lands is your limited range for the amount of lands you would put in a limited deck. And you have sort of the same graph going on here. Now, just looking at this graph, you can pretty easily see why the default for limited decks is 17 lands. I have never dipped to 15 lands in limited, to be totally honest with you. I have cut to 16. I have played 18 lands. But 17 lands is really the default, and you really need to have a reason to go lower or higher. And you can see this with the percentages on the chart. Now, what a lot of people do is cut a land on the draw. And you should use this chart for that decision as well. A lot of people in limited cut a land on the draw, actually. That's a part of a lot of people's theory around, limited and whatnot. But also on the other side, generally you want more mana on the draw anyway because you have one more, hopefully, spell in your hand. So you should keep that in mind as well. Now, the last thing I sort of wanted to look at is Frank Karsten's suggestion for how many lands you should play. And this last chart is, for constructed 18 to 27 lands, what your average CMC range and what the type of deck you're playing and how many lands you should be playing. So for example, if for 19 lands, you want your average CMC to be 0.8 to 1.212%, you want a super low curve deck, you only need 2 lands on turn 2, but would 3 lands on turn 3 for some 3 drops, right? This would be a super aggressive deck. Or a tempo-oriented deck that plays a bunch of 1-mana spells versus all the way on the other end where the 26, 27 lands where, control decks, you need your 4th land drop at 80% to function and regularly want to hit your 5th. And so lands are really important when you're constructing your decks. And looking at these charts that Frank Karsten made, hopefully can help us sort of understand how many lands we should be putting in our decks and relying on math more than just how something feels. Because we don't play enough games of Magic, and nobody plays enough games of Magic, even crazy Magic Online grinders like myself, to have a data set to have results-based thinking. Instead, having math and reading these Frank Karsten articles and watching videos analyzing Frank Karsten's data, I think is much, much more valuable. If you like videos like this and want to see more of it, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.